Welcome, everybody. Really excited to be with you here for the next MBS Highway monthly webinar. We have an all-star lineup today, so you are in for a real treat. I know I'll be feverishly taking notes, so hopefully you will be too. Now, we have both Barry and Dan Habib here, but we also have two really special guests. First, we have Julio Gonzalez. He's the founder of the Gonzalez Family Office and the CEO and founder of Engineer Tax Services, or ETS, the country's largest specialty tax engineering firm. He is in Washington, D.C. weekly to work with the administration, Congress, and Senate to advise on tax reform and is the go-to tax expert representing many national organizations and associations. So he is your tax expert here. And we also have Lacy Hunt, a return guest. Lacy is the author of 2 books and numerous articles published in Barron's, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Journal of Finance, and much more. The Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve System of Dallas also published his research, and he's made numerous presentations in major financial and economic centers all across the globe, and he's testified before various committees of Congress. So clearly you're in for a real treat. You're going to learn a lot today. Make sure you ask your questions in the chat box and the Q&A box.
Hey, everybody. It is really great to be here. I've got to tell you that, first off, anytime I get to spend with Lacy or Julio is a treat for me. Lacy, as I've always told you guys, one of my most important mentors in understanding.
You're too kind, Barry.
Well, it's the truth, Lacy, and I think Dan and Diana would agree. There's so much, and everybody in our organization really is such great appreciation for you. And also, Lacy is just such a wonderful and dear friend. I learn so much every time I speak with you. And Julio, so much love and respect for another one of my dear friends. Now, Julio is my guy to understand what is going on with Washington. Julio constantly has congressmen come to his home, come down to have dinner with him, and get his take and his advice. Julio has been kind enough to put me on one of the committees with him that gives me some incredible insights as to what is going on with tax policy in Washington. I have such gratitude for the knowledge that you've given me. So this is a real treat for me today to be with both of you incredible gentlemen and to be able to share with our subscribers here. We're over 1,000 people already that can help understand and explain a few things. We've got this big, beautiful bill, which has gone through the House, but now is been in the media a lot. It's been a political football a little bit. You've had some criticism even from Elon Musk. You've had some senators talking about this openly. I've talked to both of you gentlemen about this, and what we want to understand is, especially from the side of a interest rate perspective, we understand, I'm going to set the table a little bit here, that if we have a larger deficit, especially on percentage of debt to GDP or deficit to GDP, then the market feels like it can handle. I'm talking about the bond market here. It could cause rates to rise. And we did see some of that happen in June of 2023. We had the debt limit ceiling raised significantly. I know that's part of this big, beautiful bill that's gone through the House. But what happened shortly thereafter, and it's almost like deja vu, you had at the time, it was Fitch that had a credit downgrade. You had a debt ceiling deal done. I know we also had the banking crisis, which happened near that period of time too. The Treasury's general account was a lot less back then, but it seems similar in the setup here. And the result was not good for interest rates as we saw them rise. And I'm just a little worried that with this big, beautiful bill, if it's not received well by the financial markets, what could happen? So starting with that, and maybe I should just say a quick welcome to Dan first. I was going to first talk to you, Julio, and please tell us where you think this big, beautiful bill is. Do you think it's going to get passed? And what type of horse trading you think is going to get done?
Yeah, I definitely think it'll get passed. And Barry, it's deja vu, right? We did this in 2017. We passed the tax bill. The stars aligned, right? The House, the Senate, and the administration were all, conservative. But, you need a party all across 3 avenues to get a bill passed. And they have to get it passed, right? They have to get it passed before July 4th. So I think that'll happen. I think there'll be some bartering. And, this is political theater right now. People jockeying for what they want to bring back to their constituents where they live, the senators, the congressmen. So, yeah, ultimately, will it get done? Absolutely.
So if it will get done, and you did mention some horse trading, and I know that in your latest correspondence, which is always great, you said this is just kind of playing out like a bit of a soap opera, right? And so Julio, when this is scored, and when it's, and Dan, you've got some of the numbers on some of the scoring here for this. One of the things that I remember you telling me is that um, one of the big costs is the SALT deduction, right? The state and local tax deduction, which, if I am speaking correctly here, Julio, is about a $40,000 SALT deduction, which is an increase from the current law, which says $10,000. And I remember you telling me that while that might seem like it's being scored high, in practicality, it wouldn't be fully used. Can you explain that to everybody? Because I thought your explanation was really spot on.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of something where we have 455 people up there that decide our tax laws, but they're not accountants, they're not economists, right? And ultimately, they use a scoring system that doesn't make sense. But ultimately, when you take advantage of the SALT, the state and local tax deductions, and you're reducing your federal taxes by those payments to the state, ultimately, most of those are disallowed through AMT, alternative minimum tax. So although it scores really high that we're going back up to 40,000, in reality, no one can really take advantage of all that because it would be phased out anyway. So ultimately, it doesn't score that way because most people can't take it anyway under our current tax rules. So we have this big score that's negative, right? That's showing this deficit. But in reality, it can never get to that because most people, it would be disallowed, not taken.
That's such an interesting point. And there's a lot of flaws in the scoring, right? Lacy, I don't believe you could score for any of the tax revenue that would come in from increased activity, right? And Lacy, if the tax cuts from 2017 were not extended, what do you think happens to the economy?
Well, the economy would tank. They have to be extended. And so that part of the tax bill has to be passed. There's no question about it. They cannot allow the tax base to revert to where they were in 2016. There's no way the economy could handle that. But what the bond market is concerned about, what I'm concerned about, is the longer term deficit to GDP provisions. Now, you talked about the bond market's reaction. The bill that passed the House Appropriations Committee uh, was considerably worse from the bond market viewpoint than what was passed by the Congress. It would have raised the deficit to GDP ratio in 2025 and 2026, and there were some substantial reductions in federal spending that were put into the bill when they passed the House. And as a consequence, the way I look at it, the budget deficit under the all other things being equal provision uh, would have moved slightly lower in 2025 and 2026. Unfortunately, the bill that the House passed does not address the longer term deficit to GDP ratio. It just doesn't do it. And you've seen the scoring. Everybody's seen the scoring from the CBO. And is it overstated? Yes, it's overstated. But the debt to GDP ratio is going to continue to rise. And so therefore the debt problem has to be addressed. And this is our great opportunity to do so. And I understand that the situation in the House is delicate. It's delicate in the Senate. But this is our opportunity. And I don't want us to miss that opportunity because whenever the debt to GDP ratio, and I'm looking in terms of gross government debt, moves above 90% of GDP for more than 5 years, then it cuts the economic growth rate by 1/3 of versus trend. So your real per capita growth historically was at 2.3%. It's now running 1.2. And when you get a lower growth rate like this, it really adversely affects our modest and moderate income households. And so the to improve the situation for them and to bring down the interest rates, the longer term deficit has to be addressed. And so this is very critical. And the longer term deficit impedes growth in two ways. First of all, the interest expense is rising now, and it's going to move above what we spend for defense spending. And historically, that has been a very negative event for great empires, because the interest expense is a dead weight loss. You don't hire anyone, you don't build any bridges, you don't pay salaries by allowing the interest expense to rise. In addition, you trigger the law of diminishing returns from overusing debt capital. And so we really need to. And I thought that earlier this week, Senator Cornyn of Texas, very distinguished Republican, great ally of the president, and Ron Johnson, senator from Wisconsin, also a long time a supporter of the president, made very reasoned cases that we have to bring down the debt trajectory. And we really can't afford to have the debt trajectory rise substantially in the out years. And
Hold on one second. Hold on
problem.
one second. Lacy, hang on one second. Just want a couple of quick things. I know Dan's got a question too. Diana, remember that chart that we had that showed the debt to GDP and the deficit to GDP, how the U.S. compares everywhere? I think it'd be good just to show that to underscore some of what Lacy's saying. Go ahead, Dan.
And I just wanted for clarifying here, Lacy. So if I'm hearing you correctly, that the tax cuts had to be passed, otherwise the economy would tank. And obviously, you're talking about how the longer term debt situation, the deficit spending, I mean, this has to be addressed, right? But on the surface, I think a lot of people look at this big, beautiful bill and they say, okay, all these cuts and other provisions, it's going to, on one side, add, according to the CBO, $3 trillion in debt or $5 trillion if permanent, and the deficit to GDP ratio is going to go up to 7%. But is that only looking at one side? And I think what I'm hearing you saying is that because of this bill, it's going to cause so much economic growth that you're actually going to see the deficit to GDP ratio fall, and this is going to help us to knock down some of that debt. Is that the thought process?
I don't, not in the current circumstance. No, it will not boost the long. It will be, the economic growth will be better if we renew the tax. The bill is mainly not a tax cut. Mm-hmm. There's the tax cuts are about 100 billion a year by my calculation. Maybe Julio has a different number. The main effect of this bill is to extend the existing tax rates. Mm-hmm. It's not a tax cut, and we have to do that. The issue is whether we fully pay for the additional tax cuts. For example, the eliminating the tax on tips and the SALT tax, and whether we offset the expenditures that we have to make for border security and national defense. And so, to my way of thinking, if the economy is going to do better over the long run, we have to bring the deficit to GDP ratio down. Now, fiscal policy and the administration is handicapped here in an important measure, because the economy right now is getting weaker, dramatically weaker, in my opinion. I know the surveys are reducing the survey on recession odds. Those odds are going down, but my feeling is that the recession odds are going up, not down, and that we may already be in recession. And in this situation, monetary policy is too restrictive. It's far too restrictive, based on money supply, based on equilibrium rate of the natural rate of interest and so forth, the cost of money to our households and small businesses it's a restraint on growth. And so if Federal Reserve remains restrictive, then the risk of a recession goes up. Well, all of these assumptions about the deficit and what's going to happen then are just worthless. Because if we have a recession, even a mild recession, the deficit to GDP ratio is going to rise 2% per annum.
All right, so hold on one second. Let's keep it there. I want to turn to Julio for a second. So everybody that's watching, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. So currently, our national debt is 36.2 trillion. It might be above that because there are these extraordinary measures that are taken that can kind of keep it, because that's where the debt ceiling is. It might actually be higher than that. But when you look at that amount of debt,
125% of GDP, Barry.
that's what I was going to
It's
say.
it's above the record during World War II when we had 30 million folks in the armed services, and
Right.
it's at a deleterious impact level.
So what I was trying to exactly point out, Lacy, is that level, when you compare it to where GDP is, it is at approximately 125% of GDP. So if you're hearing these numbers, it's 125% of GDP, the debt to GDP, that's where it comes from. But then you also hear these numbers, deficit to GDP. So if our deficit to GDP, what you do is you say, okay, how much are we taking in and how much are we spending on an annual basis? And that annual basis, you probably, Julio or Lacy, can get an exact number, but for purpose of conception, it's around $2 trillion, right, guys? It's in that neighborhood.
I would say, yes, that is correct. It's approximately, before the tax bill takes effect, it's around 6.5% of GDP, more or less.
So when you hear
Maybe
these
if
numbers,
you want to say 6 to
Diana, did you find
6.5.
that slide?
Yes.
Okay.
You ready for it?
Just pull that up because I want to show you relative, everybody, to where that puts us. Okay. So just take a quick look here. Look where the United States is on deficit to GDP. Like Lacy said, there's 6.4%. Do you even see another country that's higher than that? It's the highest in the world. We have this privilege of the world's reserve currency, but this is something that is obviously a big concern. And then when you look at the debt to GDP at 123%, Japan's out of control. But other than Japan, Italy, and Portugal, we're at these high levels. So I just want to give everybody a little perspective. So
I think that if you take into account the fact that the Chinese debt, whether it's technically put at the municipal level or the federal level, is higher. The Chinese is higher, but
okay, all right.
Virtually, except for Japan and China, everybody else is below where we are. That's the issue.
Got it. So Julio, I know you talk to so many, they all come to you for your advice. Are they thinking about what Lacy just said, that all this scoring gets a lot worse because it's compared to GDP, right? So if GDP comes down, if we hit a recession, are they worried that what could happen is that even if you are successful in bringing the spending down, let's just say, but if GDP comes down, the percentage to GDP could actually worsen? Are they contemplating this?
Yeah, I think they are. And I think that's where the jockeying begins, right? And, the Senate obviously is much more concerned about it. You have your fiscal hawks there, and ultimately they're working through those right now, Barry. I think you see they're in the White House today, meeting with President Trump to kind of work through their issues. And ultimately, our tax policy committee has advised them on Congress on things in the tax bill that are not necessary that can help with that GDP score. And I think we've been helping
What are they,
them.
Julio? Give us a few of those. What are ways, like you've done this before and you advise people. If you're king for the day and you said, how would you alter this big, beautiful bill? How would you do it in a way that could appease people, but also accomplish a lot of the goals that every one of us watching this here are worried about, that it doesn't push interest rates up and address Lacy's concerns? What would be some of the advice you would give them, that this is ways that you could see improving this?
Well, we talked about SALT, right? And that although it scores high, it doesn't actually help anyone really because it gets eliminated with AMT. We have a big cost in there for immediate expensing of manufacturing facilities that corporations can't use because they put their buildings in REITs that don't pay taxes. So that's a big score in this bill, and no one can use it. And yet we're showing it as a big deficit in the scoring. So that needs to be eliminated. We've talked about that, Barry. We have advised Congress on that. Again, don't put things in there that no one can utilize. And ultimately, those are two big issues, and those need to come out.
Wow. Yeah. And what would you say that the total cost of those would be?
Well, we would get close to, I think it's 160 billion. And then, we could get close to $1 billion that is eliminated from these things that don't even work, even though they're in the House plan, right? And they ultimately, they score high, no one can use them.
Got it.
If they can't use them, why not just take them out of the bill then?
Yeah,
That's what we have advised them.
That's what I would do. Just take them out of the bill.
Just take them right out.
Yeah,
What
that would be helpful.
Julio, what are you hearing from
They can't use them anyway. I mean, if they're immaterial anyway, take them out of the bill and give that information to what the bond market will react to is the fact that they've been taken out of the bill, that the SALT tax is not available.
Yeah.
The SALT tax deduction is not available. I would say, based on my work, and I'm not the expert who knows, I would say that the SALT tax, the way they're scoring it, is worth 40 billion a year, or 400 billion over the 10 years. But I would, if I'm not going to get into this of what we should do in the individual bill. That's not my area of expertise. But we need, if let's say we don't have a recession, and that's a critical assumption, then the deficit to GDP ratio, including the revenues that we're going to get from tariffs and the savings in Doge, I would say the deficit is now around 6.5, and we come down to 5. But if we have a recession, then all bets are off. The deficit's going to go up. It can go back. It can go to 8.5. And I'm very concerned over the impact of the tariffs. Tariffs, when you raise tariffs, you sift the upward sloping supply curve inward. But virtually all of the goods in international trade are price elastic. They have a very flat demand curve. So when you shift, when you raise tariffs, you raise the prices, but you reduce the quantity demanded. The total revenue is price times quantity demanded. So total revenue falls, corporate profit margins shrink. And as a consequence, when corporate profit margins shrink, that's the second round effect. And then in the third, fourth, and fifth rounds, it reduces the demand for labor, capital, natural resources. And so you have a recessionary spiral. And so the only way that you can raise tariffs in the current environment is if you're being supported by monetary policy. Because the fiscal policy actions by itself of raising the tariffs is disinflationary and it's recessionary. And so the Federal Reserve needs to be at work here, but they contend that they're in a great place. They're not in a great place. In my opinion, they're behind the 8 ball.
Lacy, would you say the
monetary policy is in the wrong direction? And without the help of the Federal Reserve, the economic outlook is very guarded and the risk of recession is rising, which means when we talk about the deficit going down from 6.5% to 5% in 2026, that projection flies out the window, because you're going to have a decline in revenues in a recession. Your benefits will go up, your expenditures will go up, and your cost of financing the debt will go up.
But I want to take this kind of home to how it affects interest rates. But I know Dan had a question first.
Lacy, we obviously agree that the Fed is restrictive right now. Would you say, when factoring in inflation, the neutral, or R star, that they're restrictive by about 1.125%, or what would you calculate it at? How restrictive do you think that they are?
I like personally, I don't, that's not my preferred way of doing it.
Tell
I
me.
like to look at detrended real M2. Um, and in this basis, monetary growth is contracting. I know monetary growth improved since November. So did bank loans, but that was an endogenous effect. That's not an exogenous effect. That was a result of the fact that when people started all of the front running buying of imported goods and they took it into inventory, and there was some front running of consumer expenditures as well. Firms and households didn't have the cash to pay it, so they went into the banks and borrowed. And so there was been a transitory lift to money and bank credit, but that's going to reverse. Just as we can already see that the front loading or the front running of the tariffs is already unwinding. We've had significant weakness show up in purchasing manager surveys. We had a disastrous fall in the vehicle sales in May, and we're learning that the labor markets probably actually lost jobs in the fourth quarter, not gained them, based on the quarterly census of employment and wages. Really a dramatic miss, overshooting of jobs. The economy is very vulnerable in here.
So,
And there are two partners that are going to determine this outlook. And fiscal policy will be overwhelmed in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here if the economy goes into recession. And that's a very, very real risk. And the Federal Reserve is inactive. And they're claiming that everything is in good shape, that they're in a beautiful position, but they're not. And so it really throws the deficit projections to perilous risk if the economy turns down.
Lacy, yeah, and I remember you telling me that you think that the Fed should be cutting by 0.5 point right now,
I
still
do.
be restrictive. But let's think about
Financial
this.
markets don't agree with me. I mean,
Well,
that's not the common view. It's a very unpopular view.
but you've historically been way ahead and way smarter than the financial markets, and they do eventually catch up to you, Lacy. So let's give you some credit for that. But here's the thing: is that now we know the last round of Fed rate cuts, 100 basis points, 50, 25, 25, it did not result in the bond market responding
There's a
well.
good
But
reason for that,
yeah,
Barry.
well, we were in an inverted yield curve back then was one, and please give us any others. But now we're in a very much more steepened yield curve, which I think might get some money flow. But please tell us the others.
Well, if you view the global financial markets as an inverted pyramid, resting at the base of that inverted pyramid is what I call modernized world dollar liquidity. And it's the Fed's balance sheet of government and agency securities and foreign central bank holdings of treasuries. And this is your exogenous variable. It's the impact that's controlled by the Federal Open Market Committee. And because of the decline in the Fed's balance sheet of holdings, world dollar liquidity has been contracting very sharply. Historically, it grows at 10% per annum. We've had declines as great as 10%. We're getting a decline now that's not quite as steep as 10%, but it's contracting. And a real money growth in a detrended basis is in negative territory. I measure the neutral rate of interest basically to be in real terms about 1 to 1.25%. The inflation rate, the official numbers are in the low 2% number, but they're wrong. Barry, you've done outstanding work on the shelter components, more careful work than anyone I know. You're to be applauded. And the Wall Street Journal carried an article yesterday on that the Wall Street economists are now lining up with a view that you've long advocated, and the inflation rate is not really 2% or over. If you take your estimates of what's actually happening with regard to looking at rollover rents and new rents, price of homes, we're not getting a plus 3% inflation rate on something that's, more than a third of the price index. And that's the Fed is getting bad information. But let's say you take a low 2 percentage point number, you get the real per capita growth rate is 1.2. Let's say 1 to 1.5 plus 2. So you're talking a neutral federal funds rate of 3 to 3.5.
So we're
And
about one, like Dan said. Dan
we're
said
four
about
and a
one,
quarter to
1.5.
4.5. And so I think ultimately we need a 100 basis point cut this year, which no one else sees. But that's how I come about it. Monetary policy is just too restrictive.
So if the Fed were to cut 50 basis points, how do you think the bond market responds to that?
It depends in large measure how they couch it, and if they make statements that they're one and done, or that they think that monetary policy remains in a good posture and they've done enough, and they're not attenuated to the recession risks, then the bond market will assume that the Federal Reserve is not going to be supportive. And so it's not just the rate action. I mean, last fall, for example, when they were cutting the federal funds rate by 100 basis points, world dollar liquidity was still contracting at a 10% annual rate. So their exogenous, the major exogenous variable, the way I measure it, was getting more restrictive. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing these fresh signs of economic weakness that are having that are becoming clearer with each day that passes. And
Hey,
so the
Julio.
Federal Reserve is out of position.
So Julio, who are the main players in this chess match of what's going on in the Senate right now? Who should we really be listening to? You've got Johnson and Paul have been very vocal. Are they really the ones that have the weight? Who's the axe here? Who's the one that, or who are the people that you're handicapping that's saying we need to pay very close attention to what they're saying, because they're gonna be carrying the most sway?
Yeah, I mean, they're front and center in the Senate. And, Jason Smith, he's on the House side. And it comes down to those three negotiating and ultimately getting with Trump, right? And they're all in the White House today, probably trying to hammer something out and get this
Julio,
thing
which
going.
senators are there with Trump? Do you know?
I think the ones we just talked about all got called in today. So,
Would that include Johnson, Cruz, Cornyn?
yes, yes.
Would it include the Florida senator too?
Mm-hmm.
Rick Scott?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I think there's, Trump's pretty powerful right now, and let's see if he can get the two sides to come together.
What do you think they would give on? We talked about the way that, we talked about AMT, and I think that's, I don't know. I think it's going to be a tough one to get consensus. I'm sorry, AMT. I meant to say SALT. We talked about SALT and the fact that that might be a tough one to give on. Do you think there's a way that the CBO can score this in a different manner that contemplates what would be used of it when AMT is contemplated? Is that even in the conversation, or that's out of the conversation altogether? The CBO is not going to change or be more realistic.
Right, the CBO is not going to be realistic, right?
Okay.
We've educated them to change it because ultimately it has no impact for the individuals. However, that's not how our calculations are, put together. So unfortunately, it scores the same, even though it's not usable.
Got it. And what do you think are the things? I know you talked about there could be things that are given up. Where do you see this landing? Like, where do you think? I mean, all the players, they come to you for advice. You do their taxes, some of them. Where do you think the negotiation lands to get? Because you said at the very beginning, it's going to get passed, and it's going to get passed before the 4th of July, which is right around the corner. What do you think winds up happening? And what's the ultimate bill, in your opinion, look like?
I think it's going to be fairly close to what it is currently. I think they're going to listen to us in our tax policy group and eliminate some of the things that aren't utilized or minimize them. I think that's on the table that they're discussing right now. And ultimately, I think that Medicaid is a big issue, right? So how does that get addressed? I think that's the big one in the bill that the Senate and the House are fighting over. But ultimately, right, it's not a big thing in this whole big, beautiful bill, right? So our tax policy, I think, is on target with getting the tax side of this bill done.
Let me ask you something. Let's talk about that Medicaid. Could you explain that a little further to us? Because there's something in the Obamacare that affects Medicaid and is a relatively large chunk of the cost or what's being scored against. Could you talk a little bit more and explain that between you and Lacy so that everybody understands what's being debated or negotiated there?
Okay, well, just from our side on the tax side, it's basically people that qualify that maybe should no longer qualify because they can go back and be, active in the, country and in the workforce. So, that's what we're looking at on the tax side. I'll let Lacy speak to it.
Well, to me, I can't really add to what I said. It's 40 billion a year. My preference, for what it's worth, would be to find a way to actually codify a lot of the expenditure cuts that the Musk effort, the Doge effort made, put them into this bill.
Exactly.
And make them law so that the courts cannot disqualify them, and send them back to the House. And then I think there would be significant additional savings that could be achieved. But as I said, all of this effort will go down the drain if we have a recession.
Lacy, that's such a common sense thing to do. Julio, why are they not putting into law the Doge cuts?
Yeah, I think they're trying to. I think the focus is right now on getting the bill done and then passed into law. And so one step and then the other. Ultimately, if you don't get this bill done, and there's so much into it, right? And the Senate's trying to break it apart and say, pass it in two bills, right? And get the tax bill done, and then deal with the border, and then deal with security, and deal with these other things, Medicaid and Medicare, in a different bill. But ultimately, we tried that, Barry, in 2017, and what happened? Health didn't get done. Health didn't get passed. And then taxes got done a year later, barely by one vote. And ultimately, that cost small business owners, entrepreneurs, and business in general a year of unknown tax policy. And right now, we're in that same space, right? The tax policies that we had in 2017 have expired. We have high interest rates. Small businesses and international businesses don't have a policy to work with, don't know the impact on what's going to happen. And ultimately, the Fed policy is just killing and crushing businesses, whether it's here or businesses that want to come here. And that's spiraling our economy out of control.
Wow. All right. Well, Diana and Dan, I know that you've been kind of looking at some of the comments. You have some questions that we could direct from.
Yeah. I saw some questions around tariffs, and Lacy, this is directed towards you. Tariffs, obviously, there's a fear that they can be inflationary, but the other side of it is that they can cause demand destruction and recession.
It's causing it already. I think
Right.
we're seeing demand destruction. When you shift the supply curve inward, the prices rise in quantity, demand, it falls. And then in the second round, total revenue falls. And then the demand for labor, capital, and natural resources falls.
So is your thought that the tariffs are actually deflationary then?
They are deflationary, in my opinion, except for the first round effects. If you only want to look at the end of your nose, you'll say it's inflationary. But if you want to get the whole view of the panorama, they're deflationary and they're recessionary.
And if for our subscribers who are all in the mortgage business, is your feeling that if we're in a recession or close to a recession, and with this demand destruction and such, that we're going to see potentially long yields, moving in the lower direction?
I think the long yields have a fundamental case for being lower. I mean, so you've got the long yields, close to 5%. They've gone above it a few times. Encouragingly, buyers do come in at the 5% level in the 30-year. But this is the way I look at it. The versus the true inflation rate, you add normally 1.5 to 2%. And the true inflation rate is not 2%, it's less than 2. So 2 plus your real growth rate of 1.5 tells me we should be at 3.5 fundamentally. Now,
That's
can you
a
get
that's on a long bond, that's on a
yeah,
30-year
on the
treasury.
long bond?
Okay, so
Well,
the 10 years
fundamentally,
should be less.
can you get there? There are a lot of obstacles to that. One of which is what is the trend for the deficit? And Barry, you talk about the instances when the bond market reacted negatively. Go back and look at how the bond market reacted when they received the news from late Sunday there in May when the budget committee passed its bill until the passage, and when the full House bill did much better on the deficit than the committee bill.
Yes.
And
By
that
the way,
was
Lacy,
one
you
of the
deserve a lot
things.
of credit. Lacy, you said that was going to happen because the initial bill, you felt uncomfortable with it, and then when the House bill was proposed before it was passed, you said you like it a lot better. You said the bond market should respond better because the way
And they did.
and they did. You deserve a lot of credit, Lacy.
Well, thank you, but they want more. They want that trend to continue. And so the bond market, in my opinion, I hate to use this term, is aligned with Ron Johnson and his view and the impact of the longer term deficit. And I think that it's significant that the Wall Street Journal ran in a major article this week on the role that Ron Johnson is playing, because Ron Johnson is someone that has always been affiliated with President Trump, in 2016 and all the way through, and in the dark days thereafter. Senator Cruz has said that we have to cut more. Senator Cornyn, those are Trump allies. But they're saying that more has to be done, and the bond market is expecting that be done. And I think that the administration and the country would be better served if the longer term deficit to GDP and debt to GDP ratios are brought down. But I hate to be repetitive, but it's not going to matter if we have a recession.
Yeah, I get you. But Lacy, the way I see it, and Julio, please correct me if I'm wrong here, is that a lot of the expenditure portion of it is front loaded and the savings are back loaded. How does the bond market interpret that, guys?
They don't believe the backloading. That's the problem. They want the expenditure cuts now. That's what they want.
Julio, is that
You
part
don't
of
get credit. You don't get credit for expenditures in 2029 and 2030. We will have a new administration at that time. You have to cut the spending now to be credible. That's my view. Maybe I'm wrong about it.
Julio, what are you hearing? Is that something that's being part of the negotiation, that some of those spending cuts have to be moved up into the front loaded area?
100%. 100% they have to be to get this passed and get it through Senate.
Well, that would be encouraging, although I guess part of the reason why the administration wants more activity up front is to avoid the recession, right? And so it's like it's a very thin line. This is no wonder why this is so tricky. It's a very, very thin line. So Lacy, Scott Besson told me that he has a target on the 10-year treasury of 3.9%. How realistic is that? And then how much do you think the bank deregulation deal, where the supplemental leverage ratio is helped by having no hit for holding a risk-free asset like a treasury to banks, how much would that impact things? Now, Besson said,
I think it's worth 50 basis points plus or minus 20. So let's say 30 to 70.
well, that's huge.
It
Yeah, that's
depends
big.
on when you make the announcement. And so if the Fed is cutting the rates and they're announcing the rate cut and they also reduce the supplementary reserve ratio at the same time, then that has more of an impact than, if they just announce it by itself. Packaging these deals is a very important matter, in my opinion. It shouldn't matter, but it does.
Understood. Understood. Dan or Diana, some questions from everybody.
So-
I mean, by the way, gents, this is fascinating. Thank you so much, both of you. Dan or Diana, any
So
questions?
just to clarify that, right? Because maybe some people didn't understand that, right? So the supplemental reserve ratio, Lacy, is where the Fed basically says that they have to increase the amount of reserves held like above the basic requirements. And right now, if they hold treasuries, that kind of goes against that. But if you do the bank dereg, they could hold treasuries more easily and it won't impact that, right? And
That's
because
correct.
of that, they can then purchase a lot more treasuries and it won't impact the amount they can lend and make money with.
Yeah.
And that increased demand will cause yields to fall.
And by the way,
well said. I'm not going to correct anything you said. You got it perfectly, Dan.
Thank you.
and if I may just get to what everybody, we got 1,200 people. I want to make sure everybody understands this. So forgive me if you already know this, but banks make money by borrowing money from folks like us and lending it out at a higher level. It would be a great game if you would be unrestricted or unlimited in the amount you could borrow and lend out, but you are restricted by a capital ratio. In other words, it gets risky. How do you pay back the depositors if loans go bad? So they have to be limited in the amount that they are able to lend, so making money on that, by the amount of capital that they have so that they can make good on loans that go bad. So if you are restricted with the supplemental leverage ratio, saying that if you're holding treasuries, which they say is a risk-free asset, that means that it is kind of going against your capital account. By you being able to say, we've got this ability to purchase treasuries without it restricting our ability to make money and lend more money, well, then you'd be more inclined to buy treasuries. You buy treasuries, you buy 10-year treasuries, the yield comes down, presumably everything else equal, ceteris paribus. But then that also should help mortgage rates.
It will, and also keep in mind that you have this negative exogenous effect from the fact that the Fed's balance sheet is shrinking. World dollar liquidity is shrinking. The federal funds rate is too high. If you look, according to the National Federation of Independent Business, the business loan rates are at 10%. Your audience knows the rule of 72. By the rule of 72, you're going to if you borrow $100,000 in 7 years, you're going to double your interest expense. So those rates are too high. The consumer loan rates are too high, and because of the fact that world dollar liquidity was still contracting in the fall, and the Fed's messaging was very unclear, they cut the federal funds rate, but they negated it by their actual balance sheet actions and the open mouth policy that they were projecting to the market. And so the federal funds rate came down, and the critical yields and business loan and consumer loan rates didn't drop.
Yeah, and then
In a lot of cases they went up.
And just to clarify, Treasury Holdings did not sink SVB. You could couch it that way, but that's not what really happened. It was the realization of losses based upon the fact that they were holding 2% paper and they didn't mark it to market. When they marked it to market or had to liquidate them, they had to realize those losses. So totally different thing.
Yeah.
Dan, Diana, you seeing anything that?
Let's see.
Are you going through some of these questions here?
Sorry, muted. Yeah, I'm looking right now. I know one of our team members, Bill Hagman, actually, he wanted to be on this call, but he couldn't. He was asking. He saw that lately Elon Musk has received a lot of criticism, or he's been giving a lot of criticism toward the big beautiful bill and trying to not get it passed. Julio, what do you think about that? Do you think he actually has the ability to, get a lot of people behind that to not allow this thing to pass?
No, I don't think so. I mean, certainly, it makes for good media coverage. It draws a lot of attention, but ultimately, I don't think it impacts this bill getting done.
Sure. And I know another topic.
I've got one in between that I wanted to just ask Lacy, because we talked about this, Lacy, and I was fascinated by this because you pointed out something very interesting. So we know Jerome Powell, like him, hate him, love him, whatever, agree with him, don't agree with him. His tenure or his chairmanship ends in roughly 11 months,
Yep.
right? Sometime around
Mid-May.
then, in mid-May.
Mhm.
So who's going to be the next Fed chair? And you pointed out a vacancy and how the next chair appointment works and how critical and why we should all be watching this next vacancy that's coming up, I believe in February or in January.
No, the last day of January,
Okay.
Adriana Kugler's, all board members are given 14-year terms, and they all expire on January the 31st of even years. So the Kugler term expires the last day of January. Now, the Powell's term, expires in roughly mid-June, so mid-May. So here's the problem. So um, the the president needs to announce who is going to replace Kugler sometime in the fall. But if Powell is going to stay until May and not give up his seat, in other words, he's going to hold on to the end of May, and he communicates that to the White House, then basically the White House has to do either one of two things. Number one, it could appoint its choice and so designate that choice as the replacement for Kugler, which creates a very sticky situation because he's putting someone on the board, and that person going onto the board at the end of January, 1st of February, would then be his designee to be chairman of the board, with Powell still sitting there until May. Now, if he doesn't do that, then he has to be satisfied with the current members of the board.
Does that open it up for Chris Waller?
Yeah, that would open for Waller.
And so
The two leading candidates are Warsh and Waller. And if he wants Waller, I mean, if he wants Warsh, he's going to have to put him in Kugler's seat unless he has assurances from either Powell or someone else on the board that they're getting ready to go off.
So there you have it, everybody. You know who the next Fed chair is going to be. It's going to be either Christopher Waller, currently a governor. He's been pretty dovish, so that could be well aligned. But you also, if
Clearly
Trump,
campaigning for the job, in my opinion, and
yes,
he's saying he's saying things that I agree with, basically, and he's the one that, in my opinion, is being the most realistic, and his views are also most closely aligned with the president. So it's a very tricky situation. We've never been in this with this complexity before.
And by the way, we got to give Waller credit because in 2021 and 2022, while many Fed members, Daley, you had Messer, you had who are the others? There was Kashkari, Jerome. They were begging for inflation. We need more inflation.
Yeah.
Waller was very level-headed, and he was more concerned about down the road and, be careful what you ask for, while everybody else was begging for that inflation.
Yeah.
So,
He has a good record, Waller. He has a good record. So does and Kevin Warsh has a good record too. They both have great records,
and it would be nice to have an economist instead of a lawyer in that seat.
I think it would be. I'm biased, of course.
Diane, I'm sorry I interrupted you to get that question in.
That was the question I was going to ask. So perfect.
Okay, good. Okay, good. And Dan, are you noticing anything that we should bring up here at the end? I noticed that, guys, they noticed there was a lot of questions on loan level price adjustments
Yep.
and GSEs and the privatization of the GSEs. Now, I certainly would allow Julio and Lacy, who have amazing insights everywhere here, to opine on it. But I will tell you that in the call that we're doing, Diana, correct me if I'm wrong, it's the 17th
Yes, sir.
with Director Pulte. Those are going to be best directed right to the source. I mean, just ask him. But I will tell you what Director Pulte told me at dinner, and Dan was there, is that if they do it, they want to do this, take it private, but do it within conservatorship still, which is very interesting. Maybe I'll ask Julio and Lacy what you think of that. And then
I
would
don't know
that
what they mean by that, but
I think they
Well,
mean like they would still guarantee, there would still be like implicit guarantees there, right?
they would give the implicit guarantee, but it would be within conservatorship, but still take it public. They would still take it public. I meant to say public. I think by
Yeah.
accident I said private. So still take it public, but within conservatorship. And the idea there is that just like if you had a company, you took it public, you would
No
raise an enormous amount of money. That money, according to Director Pulte, he said, well, that would belong to the United States. Does that mean that that gets put against the debt, against the deficit? What, I mean, can you guys just give us what you think about that?
Yeah,
Julio, you
I
go.
think Barry,
this is too political for me. I can't
Okay.
go there.
Okay.
Barry, I do think there'll be some voodoo math and voodoo magic. Ultimately, let's go back to the question about Elon Musk for a second, because Barry, you know, every year we have a couple of pending government shutdowns, right? Shutdowns are coming. We're never going to get Congress together. Government's going to shut down. And what happens? They ultimately come together. Barry, I think even more urgent this time around before July 4th is midterm elections, right? So no matter what Elon Musk says, whatever the Senate is thinking, they realize this doesn't get done and they face termination come midterm elections. So, you know, I think that, and like government shutdowns, you always have these urgencies. And somehow, because of those things seem to get done at the end.
Well, I've got, as I look at the clock here, I'm going to ask the last question. I've been saving this one. So here it is. I've been waiting. Now, within the big, beautiful bill, there is an increase in the debt ceiling by $4 trillion. Please tell me, guys, how do you think the markets respond to that? Because I just get a little nervous. The last time the debt ceiling was raised, it was a little bit dicey for interest rates on the mortgage side, which everybody here is very, worried about as far as, how this impacts their business, but also how it really affects homeowners and what they pay in mortgage. Do you think that raising the debt ceiling $4 trillion would be well received or tolerated by the bond market? I know there's a lot of other factors, but does it worry you? And then what about this talk where, oddly enough, strange bedfellows, President Trump and Elizabeth Warren are both in agreement that we should do without the debt ceiling? So can I just get some quick thoughts for you guys on both of on how you feel about the increase of the debt ceiling and whether it should stick?
Julio, you go first.
You know, Barry, I think it'll be tolerated as it's been tolerated every other year and every other increase, on the individual basis. Obviously the bond market, not so well, but I think if we have a history of doing it and a history of tolerating it, and ultimately they need to get something done urgently. So, my guess is it'll be tolerated.
We will survive it regardless of what happens. The issue is whether it's tied to bringing those future expenditures forward and giving a more credible path to a reduction of the deficit. If it doesn't do that, then the debt ceiling increase will not be well received. Assuming that the economy is not clearly in a recession by then, which may be the case,
Yeah.
in my view. And so if we're in a recession, it really won't matter because there will be a major business cycle effect driving the rates lower.
Well, gentlemen, it's like I blinked and an hour has passed. Both of your brilliance is so appreciated. It's a very difficult topic, and everybody who's listening, hopefully we got insights. Answers are hard to come by here because we don't know what the ultimate package is going to be. We don't know if there's going to be a recession. We don't know what's going to be front loaded. This is hard for us, right? So all we're trying to do here is allow you to kind of get a deeper dive from some of the smartest minds literally in the world that are close to it, that understand this, that can hopefully put us in a position to where we have some better understanding. We know what to look for and hopefully have a better way to advise our customers and even ourselves personally as to how this may impact us. If I'm hearing you guys correctly, Julio, you believe a deal is going to get done. You think it's going to get done by the 4th of July. And I would never bet against Julio because he's got the inside track on this. And Lacy, my mentor, there's so much that rides on whether we're in a recession or not and what is front loaded in this or not. But I think that ultimately you feel optimistic that interest rates.
I think that getting it done by July 4th is a better than 50-50 deal, but I think there's also a risk that this won't be done until Congress is terminating its business in December, there before the Christmas break. That's an alternative scenario that I think people should be aware of.
And I'm hoping you're seeing all this love and applause that you guys are deserving to receive. Diana, thank you always for all of your.
Could I just say something, Barry? I want to congratulate you on the great job you do and tell you what a pleasure it is for me to be on your program.
Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I give all the credit back to my team. That's, Dan and Diana and the entire team.
They're a great team. I enjoy working with them every time. What a pleasure.
They're so great. They're so great. I'm the luckiest guy out there to have such a brilliant team.
Well,
Love
we're
you
lucky to have
guys.
you. So thank you, everyone.
Love you guys. Hey, everybody who tuned in today. Thank you. God bless you. We appreciate you so much. I love this call. I'm looking forward to Bill Pulte coming up in just a short, what is it, Diana? 12 days to Bill Pulte.
Yep.
So we will try and continue to do our best. We've got some other ones coming up our sleeve that if we can nail them, we'll make sure that we can bring them to you. And after this is all done, guys, you're welcome to come back and give your breakdown of the ultimate bill.
And thank you, Lacy and Julio, for coming on today. We really appreciate it.
Barry. All the best, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye, guys.